I will give the floor to Sara Brosché, Science Advisor of IPEN. And Sara, as I already introduced in the very beginning of this session, will talk about chemical additives to plastic and ocean pollution. And that's, as you know, one of the important matters that people used to mention when talking about the hazards related to plastic pollution. And you've been already told today about plastic being inert material as such, but the associations with chemical additives makes it much more harmful to marine environment and also to health. So Sara has been working as a science advisor for a number of years, and mostly on the issues related to Stockholm Convention implementation, Basel Convention, and also strategic approach to international chemicals management, IPEN, including the IPEN's toxic plastic campaign. And she joined IPEN since 2012. So Sara, without any further delay, I will give you the floor to talk.
Thank you very much. And let's see if I can share my screen as well.
Perfect.
Let's see here. All right. Can you both see the presentation and hear me fine?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay! Good start. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this issue. I'm based in Gothenburg, Sweden, so the Baltic is very close to me as well. So I'm glad that I could join a little bit for your conference. Just to start with IPEN, I know some of you already know IPEN, but it's a global network of non-profit NGOs around the world. We have partners in 125 countries currently, working together for a toxic-free future. And the model of IPEN is to connect NGOs around the world to make sure that we can learn from each other, both to work together on national level activities, but also making sure that civil society can participate and has a voice in international meetings, such as ICAM and the chemicals conventions. So I'm going to talk about toxics. Usually when people talk about ocean pollution, it's very much what you can see, even though microplastics is also getting more and more attention right now. But people don't know as much about the life cycle of plastic and that it involves toxic chemicals. I will not go into each of these stages, but I just want to highlight and that it's really important to understand that plastics is such a big issue when it comes to social justice, when it comes to environment health, and so on and so forth. And not only the trash you see in the ocean. And I'm going to focus a lot on the chemical additives today. I'm a chemist by training, so I like talking about the chemistry. And it's also something that most people have not heard before, is that when you have a plastic material, you will also have chemicals in there. And the British Plastics Federation actually says on their website that without additives, plastics would not work. So when you talk about plastic, you really have to look at both the whole life cycle and the whole content of the plastic to make informed decisions around it. I am sure you have seen part of this 1,000 times before, but this is important when it comes to chemical additives. So I'm gonna say this again, that the plastic is constructed from these single monomers, the molecules that are chained together to polymers, and then these polymer chains are sort of stacked together. So you have basically a 3D structure with a lot of holes in it. So it's not as solid as you might think when you look at it. And that is important because chemical additives are typically only mixed with the plastic. So that means in most cases, there are exceptions to this, but in most cases, it's just sort of filling those spaces. And that also means that it will eventually leach out. And also, as I'm sure you already know, that plastics are different depending on what the building blocks are. So I've just added a few of the most common ones here. But that has implications, of course, both to what additives you would use in that plastic, but also what properties that plastic have and how much of the additives leach out as well. These are some of the major groups of chemical additives that are added to plastics. So you have plasticizers to make the plastic more flexible, especially for PVC. You have flame retardants that are used in electronics, in the electronics casings. You have different types of stabilizers that make sure that the plastic don't degrade. Pigments, of course, if you have red or yellow plastic, you will have pigments in there. And then you have plastics actually that contain biocides for special uses. Not all plastics contain all of these additives, but almost all plastics will contain one or more of them. And looking at these ones, I of course chose examples that have been started to be regulated now internationally. But what we see here that these groups all include a wide variety of chemicals that are known to cause harm. So many of these are not supposed to be used anymore. They are internationally, but they are on the way to be phased out, hopefully, most of them. But it's good to know that while these are being phased out, and these cause endocrine disruption, you have various neurological effects, you have cancer-causing chemicals, these will be replaced with other chemicals. And in the case of bisphenol A, for example, you will have, instead of bisphenol A, you might have bisphenol S, which is very similar, but it's not maybe regulated in the country where you live. There was a study done in the EU a couple of years ago that looked at what chemical additives are actually registered and used in the EU. So the authors of the study, they looked at the REACH registrations and then they contacted plastics industry to have confirmed what additives are actually used. And they come up with a list of 418 substances that was confirmed as in use today. And if you look at the right column there, you see that a large portion of these are actually under regulatory scrutiny. So that means that there is some concern, health or environment concern with these plastics. And I was surprised, even though I kind of knew, I was surprised about the big numbers here. If you look at the plasticizers, more than half that are registered are under some kind of regulatory scrutiny. So that's concerning, to say the least. I should also add that I'm not sure if these presentations are being shared afterwards, but I do have a slide where I added links to all the things, studies and other things that I show here, so you can have a look yourselves. One other interesting fact was that 11% of these substances, where you see other stabilizers, other functions, people actually don't know what they're used for. So that's also, and then you, of course, if you don't know the function, you don't know typically the hazard of that chemical. But all this taken together means that we are exposed to these plastic additives. If you have plastic materials in your house, the chemicals will enter into the dust of the house. Food packaging has been an increasingly big issue in the EU lately. And there is a new regulation coming, it seems like, which is very, very good. Microplastics, of course, as we heard. There are also some chemicals that can be absorbed through the skin, but that's not the main route of exposure. Also, just an example of a study where the scientists looked at some plastic consumer products to see what kind of toxicity they might exert. And looking at those, 74% contain chemicals that in their tests triggered at least one human toxicity endpoint. So that the most common one was cell toxicity, very general mechanism of action, but also 27% endocrine disruption. The worst one were PVC and polyurethane, but I also want to mention that they saw very high baseline toxicity in what's called bioplastics, the PLA. So just because it says bio, it doesn't mean it's good for you necessarily. So that's also good to know. So when plastics end up in the ocean, these chemical additives will be released into the ocean. Now this study looked at the data from 2015 and looked at 20 chemicals and came to the conclusion that the debris could be bottles, bottle caps, and so on, grocery bags, so on and so forth, that if they looked at the chemical additives and the number or the amount of trash ending up in the ocean, they estimated that that year 190 tons of these additives entered the ocean, which is a quite staggering number. So only 20 chemicals, but thinking back to the EU study where they found more than 400, it's quite concerning to think about where those end up and how much is actually entering the oceans. And not only will plastic release chemical into the ocean, it can also absorb what's already in there. Both bigger plastic pieces, but also microplastics. So you will have PCBs, for example, or other type of aromatic compounds like the PIHs. A lot of chemical abbreviations or acronyms here, it doesn't really matter, but these are environmental contaminants that can attach to these plastics. And that means that wildlife will be exposed as well to these additives. These headlines are not uncommon, unfortunately. So I picked a few of them, but these really show that the whole chain of contamination, so to speak, and that some studies, or quite an increasing number of studies, show that plastic pollution do lead to chemicals building up in various seabirds and other sea life. So talking about citizen science, this is something that is close to my heart as well, because we do a lot of that. With the global network, we have the benefit that we can work together in many countries, in many regions. So we have 2 projects going right now that is specifically aimed at looking at toxic chemicals in plastics. So our first project is beach samples. So looking at plastic fragment and plastic pellets washed up on beaches in 35 countries, and looking for persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disrupting chemicals. So I have colleagues from Costa Rica in one photo there. And the other project is looking at small, local, small-scale recycling facilities. This is becoming increasingly with the increasing recycling, which is a good thing, but there is a lot of small-scale recycling happening where there is no control over what's in the plastics that is being recycled. So we are getting samples from 30 countries from these type of small-scale recyclers to see if that is a concern. And we're doing this together with International Pellet Watch, I should say, as well, hosted at Tokyo University in Japan. And the reason why we're concerned about this is because we know from previous studies conducted together with colleagues from the Czech Republic at Arnica and Bund and others. We know that when you recycle plastic with toxic chemicals, you will just move these toxic chemicals over to the new project. And that has been seen in, these are 3 reports, there are more. Also a number of scientific studies around this through peer-reviewed articles, that you will see this widespread contamination in, for example, children's products and food contact materials, which is, again, very concerning. It's also important to remember when it comes to toxic chemicals in plastics that there is no treatment today that deals with that safely and effectively. So you actually need to start the production. As with the whole issue of plastics in general, you have to start at the production stage and turn off the tap, but also you have to start regulating what you're allowed to put in the plastics. This is not something, while consumers have a lot of power, and that is of course something that should be supported and that should be taken advantage of. When it comes to chemicals, it's typically very, very difficult to know what's in your product. So it's again important to realize that this is not a consumer responsibility. I cannot, in most cases, tell what's in a product I buy. So it has to be regulated. And I know David had a presentation earlier today about international regulations or international efforts to that. I wanted to add a few more to that list. Maybe he already did. And I will not go into these, but just to show that there are so many different types of regulatory controls and pathways that can be used to start minimizing both plastic pollution in general, but also what's in the plastic. And our focus is very much the chemicals and waste aspects. So the conventions and the strategic approach to international chemical management, but also the UN Environment Assembly process that David spoke about earlier. And when it comes to legally binding processes, you have the two conventions. So the Stockholm Convention lists persistent organic pollutants for global elimination. So that includes several toxic chemicals that have been added to plastics. And you have the Basel Convention that controls export of plastic waste and hazardous waste. And there are a number of EU processes going on as well. And I thought that was an important piece to add to this slide, since many of the countries I believe you are in are EU countries with the microplastics that are being regulated, but also the various restriction or regulation of chemicals, regulatory controls of what's allowed in new products and also what's allowed in waste and recycled products. So those are just some examples of where it would be good to engage and what's going on. I am at the end of this presentation, but I wanted to show our resource page if you're interested in the issue of toxic plastics. And there is also my email. I'm always happy for getting emails with questions or getting emails from people, so don't hesitate to do that. Specifically on ocean pollutants, IPEN produced an ocean pollutants guide with NTN from Australia a couple of years ago, where this is things that I've talked about very, very briefly. Is you have a much more in-depth discussion of those there. And as I mentioned, here's some links to photos and different references if you want to read further. But apart from that, I wanted to say thank you.